Connectors are the crucial link that ties a fall protection system together. Choosing the right one is the key to ensuring that when you're working at heights, you're going to be doing so safely and effectively. In today's Feature Friday, we're going to take an in-depth look at lanyards, SRLs, and PFLs. If you haven't yet, make sure to watch our previous episodes covering anchorage and body support as part of the ABCDs of Fall Protection. So the first product we're going to talk about is lanyards. Lanyards are very basic, usually made for preventing falls, so they're used for positioning or for restraint, so to make sure that you're not getting too close to an edge. And generally, they're made for absorbing the initial shock if there is an impact and fall that takes place. They've long been the go-to for fall protection, but have fallen out of favor mostly to the self-retracting devices, such as personal fall limiters and self-retracting lifelines. They are generally cheaper than SRDs, which is a benefit, but they don't really activate until a person actually has fallen the length of the lanyard, which is a bit of a risky point. So generally, their intended use is to limit the working radius of the employee, but that does mean that if they need to move to other areas, they do need to make some disconnections and reconnections in between. Traditionally, these are also typically used for aerial lifts, boom lifts, scissor lifts. However, they have also become kind of surpassed now by the PFLs that come in various options for a 6-foot length tie-off that just generally offer some better protection. Next, we're going to talk about self-retracting lifelines. So these units contain a spring-loaded retracting web or cable lanyard. Units are usually mounted directly to an anchor point, often above a dorsal D-ring, although if they are intended for leading edge, you will find that they can go at foot tie-off level. They do function like a seat belt with an internal braking system, which engages in response to the sudden tension. Ideal when conditions pose the risk of sudden free fall, which is great, and they can achieve complete fall arrest within about 2 feet. Now, retracting line prevents tripping hazards on the job site. However, it is important to keep in mind that if you're working on more of a sloped environment, you may find that the lanyard itself is going to be slowly going down and may not activate as the seatbelt mechanism would intend. And finally, in terms of working lengths, you're going to see a pretty wide range in the industry. Typically, you'll see anything from about 10 feet upwards of over 150 feet. Usually at MacMor, what we stock is a 20, 30, and 50-footer option. Next, we're going to get into the personal fall limiters or PFLs. So these are very similar concept to an SRL, but normally more compact and lightweight. So the units are usually connected directly to a worker. Working lengths are anywhere between 6 to 10 feet, and it really varies based on kind of the configurations. There are some that are single, some are dual leg, and you'll also see some that have a dorsal pad for just a little bit more comfort, and some that simply don't. Now, as we mentioned, it does have a similar braking mechanism to the SRLs, but it is designed to arrest shorter fall distances. Often there's a swivel attachment that provides improved mobility and range, especially since it's attached directly to the worker. So the CSA standard classifies SRDs or self-retracting devices into 4 main classes. So the class SRL is kind of the default. So the SRL is anchored at an elevation that limits the free fall to the activation distance on the device. The extracted lifeline cannot bear against an edge or surface during fall arrest at the risk of cutting the lifeline itself. Next, you'll have the SRLR class, which is essentially any SRL device that's provided with an integral means for assistance in rescue. Now, raising or lowering a rescue subject is essentially what these are mainly used for, and they typically have a much longer length and a hand crank in some cases. SRL LE, so the LE stands for leading edge, so anchored lower than the elevation of the dorsal D-ring on the worker's full body harness, as we talked about in the previous instance. That is one of the possible options you may see for one of these. And the extracted lifeline can bear against an edge or surface during fall arrest without cutting through the lifeline. And finally, there's a combination of all these elements. So you'll have the class SRL LER, which essentially would be a leading edge rescue SRL. Now, when it comes to the material of the lifeline itself, you're going to find yourself in 2 different camps. There's either the web-based or the cable-based. Now, the stainless steel and galvanized cable SRDs are going to be more durable over the web alternate, and generally they're going to just have more endurance environments that have elevated heat, or areas with marine environment that have elevated salt levels, or generally just anything with more caustic materials in the air. Now, steel cables can withstand abuse like cuts and scrapes more than web. However, make sure to check what class your SRD does belong to. As we mentioned earlier, there's the class for the leading edge, and just because something is technically a cable-based SRD doesn't inherently make it leading edge. In the same way that just because something is leading edge doesn't mean it's going to be cable, which means that there are also web-based PFLs and SRLs that have leading edge capability. Now, your nylon or your polyester SRDs are going to be well suited when you don't want a steel cable rubbing against sensitive or valuable equipment. If you're working around airports or tied off on an airplane, kind of doing some maintenance, and you don't want that steel cable to rub right against the airplane paint or the components themselves, that's kind of where for sure you're going to have an advantage with the web-based. Generally, web-based are also non-conductive, so it's also preferred when working around electrical equipment. And finally, your nylon or synthetic web SRDs are typically more affordable and roughly about 15% lighter than the cable alternate. Now, this generally makes them quite popular among companies that are going to be buying stuff in bulk volumes, or just for individuals that are looking to manage their budget a little bit better, but need to work at height and want to do so with a bit of a better system over a standard basic lanyard. Now, when we're talking about fall clearance, your connectors do come into play. So now when we're measuring fall clearance, one main thing to keep in mind is that fall clearance is essentially the distance that's required to prevent the worker from hitting the ground or the lower level when a fall takes place. Now, when you're measuring fall clearance distances, it does greatly vary on the connector type. If you're going to be using a lanyard, your calculations are more based on the distance between the anchor point to the next lower level or ground. In the case of an SRD, your calculations are based on the distance between the surface on which the worker is standing on and the lower level or ground. So we'll get into the math real quick. When using a lanyard, your clearance calculation is going to be that you'll have a free fall distance, so let's say the length of the lanyard generally, so say we're using a 6-foot lanyard. Your deceleration distance, when the fall arrest system activates, you're looking at a max, usually at 3.5 feet, 4 feet. And then of course you have a D-ring shift because your D-ring, dorsal D-ring gets pulled up as you have that fall tension that takes place. So you can roughly estimate about a foot of additional distance there. And then you have the worker's height. So if you have someone that is about 5'5" versus someone that's over 6 feet, there's definitely going to be a fairly significant difference there. And finally, always have to include a safety factor, which roughly we would say about 2 feet. So when you put that all together, if you're using a 6-foot lanyard and you have a worker that's about 5'10", you would require nearly about 19 feet of clearance for that to be safe. Now, of course, your free fall distance can vary depending on where the anchor point is in relation to the worker's D-ring. So this is because a lanyard needs to stretch completely before deploying, as we mentioned earlier. Now, if the anchor is above the D-ring, we subtract the distance between the anchor and D-ring from the free fall distance and vice versa. And of course, if you're not directly under your anchor point and you happen to be a few feet at a certain distance, left or right, if you do take a fall, there's also a swing factor to keep in mind for extra safety. Now, when it comes to self-retracting devices, it's a bit of a different game. Because these are always taught by design, we measure fall clearance from the worker's feet. So when using a self-retracting device, our formula is going to be a little bit different. So first we're going to look at the activation distance. Most SRDs are allowed up to about 4.5 feet of payout once the system is detected a fall. As for a D-ring shift, you always have the same thing. There's going to be that tension on the dorsal D-ring, so about a foot of safety right there. And finally, safety factor is always necessary, so we'll say another 2 feet on that. So now with the same worker at 5'10" using a previous scenario here, but now using an SRD, you would require only about 7.5 feet of clearance as opposed to the previous 18 feet. Very different story. So finally, hopefully this has helped you guys kind of make some sort of decision whether a basic lanyard, an SRL, or a PFL is the right product for you. Of course, it also does depend on the application. In some cases, PFLs for sure is the way to go. In other cases, an SRL is great, or you can definitely get by with something a little bit more affordable, like a basic lanyard, depending on the application. Now, that said, if you do have some equipment lying around and you want to make sure that it's always up to par with where it should be for some safe work, generally, you are always supposed to pre-inspect your equipment before you go and use it. But that said, after some time, you may want to have some expert eyes on some of the gear, or you want to make sure that, if something seems to be jamming in your SRL, that you can have it looked at. MacMor is in fact certified to do soft goods inspections. So that includes your general lanyards, your harnesses, things like that. But also on MSA SRLs, we can do some maintenance and repairs on those units if that's something that you're needing. Of course, thanks again for checking it out, guys. Please like and subscribe. If you like the content, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions. We're always happy to help out where we can. And stay safe out there.